Kyle's story began in 1880 when a patch of land along the railroad gave rise to a new town.
Beneath the shade of what's now known as the Auction Oak, early residents gathered to bid on town lots and build a future from the ground up.
Over the decades, Kyle remained a small but close-knit community.
A place where local leadership laid the groundwork for future growth.
And civic spaces like the public square, also known as Mary Kyle Hartson Park,
became gathering places for generations. At the turn of the century, Kyle entered a new era of growth. Roads were widened, neighborhoods developed,
And new schools and businesses brought fresh energy to the city's rhythm.
Today, Kyle is one of the fastest growing cities in Texas. And with that growth comes a responsibility to preserve what makes our community great.
while also planning for the future.
As Mayor Mitchell reflects on where we've been and where we're going, one thing is clear. Kyle's greatest strength is his people, past, present, and future.
In December of 1903, two bicycle mechanics from Ohio, brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright, coaxed a fragile craft into the air at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their machine was little more than canvas stretched across spruce wood, held together with wire, a gasoline engine, and a pair of propellers carved by hand. The flight lasted just 12 seconds and covered 120 feet, shorter than the wingspan of a modern 747. But it was enough. For the first time in human history, a powered, heavier-than-air machine lifted from the earth, stayed aloft, and landed under control. In the immediate years that followed, aviation became a national fascination. Newspapers filled their pages with tales of daring flights. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How far can a plane travel? Can it cross a city, a state? What about an entire continent? In 1911, a powerful news publisher named William Randolph Hearst offered a prize of $50,000 to the first aviator who could complete a transcontinental flight in under 30 days. 8 pilots tried. Only one came close. His name was Cal Rogers, a towering 6'4" aviator, partially deaf, always with the cigar in his teeth. He had only learned to fly a few months earlier, yet piloting came naturally. Rogers bought a Model EX from the Wright brothers and set out to win the prize. He decided to follow the railroad, accompanied by a 3-car support train with mechanics, spare parts, reporters, and even his family. If he broke down, they would fix the plane in real time and get right back up in the air. He named his airplane the Vin Fizz Flyer, after the great drink that sponsored his quest. That fall, Rogers set out from Brooklyn, New York, in front of several hundred spectators. People cheered and waved hats as the Vin Fizz Flyer rattled down the field and lifted up from the ground. On October 18th, 114 years ago to the day, Rogers landed in Waco, Texas. The next day, he took off heading south. By the time he reached Austin, 3,000 people had traveled by streetcar and then walked a mile to where Rogers would land. This is the picture of the scene in Austin. When the train pulled up, agents hopped out and showered the spectators with advertisements as if it was confetti. They had all kinds of souvenirs to sell, including postcards and specialty stamps. Folks were told that Rogers would carry those postcards in his pocket and mail them at his next landing. In other words, this was the first airmail postal delivery service in human history. 1 hour after touching down in Austin, Rogers took off again. He circled the new Capitol Dome, it was 20 years old, waved at the crowd below, and turned south towards San Antonio. And because he followed the railroad, everyone in Kyle knew exactly what that meant. He would be flying directly overhead. Now keep in mind, no one in Kyle had ever seen a plane. No plane had ever flown over Hays County. No plane had ever landed in Hays County. You may wonder, what was Kyle like in 1911? Would you like to see? Did anyone go to Founders Day last Saturday and watch the parade down Center Street? Here's an image of the same parade on the same route in 1911. You will notice that Old City Hall, which is now the Krug Activity Center, named after Mayor Pete Krug, is missing from this photo. It should be on the right side, but Old City Hall was not constructed until the following year, which you can see in this picture from the parade just a year or two later. Business in Kyle was booming in 1911. At the back of this picture, you can see the train depot, which was the economic engine to the city of Kyle. To the right of the depot, you can see a 2-story hotel where travelers would stay when they got off the train. Kyle actually had multiple downtown hotels in 1911. Here's a view of the train depot from the south. You can see how they used the land around the tracks for staging of goods to be loaded and unloaded on the train. Unfortunately, the trains at that time produced lots of sparks when they stopped, and the Kyle Depot in this image would burn to the ground in 1916. It would be replaced by the depot that now serves as a museum next to City Hall. Here's a picture of the train depot's platform in 1911. Notice the way the folks are dressed who traveled by train. Very chic, I think. If you stood on that platform and looked west down Center Street, this is what you would see. Modern day City Hall would be on the right. Further down, the Sledge Mercantile store is on the right. Here's what that store looked like on the inside. Notice the types of dry goods they sold. Don't you want to walk in there and buy something? Here's the Kyle Creamery. It was located next to the D.A. Young building, which is pictured here. This building was constructed in 1881 and is the oldest structure still standing in Kyle today. Give me a cheer if you've ever seen or been to the D.A. Young building. Here's the H.C. Wallace Lumber Company. That's Mr. Wallace on the porch. His daughter-in-law, Laura Bell Wallace, would teach students in the community for more than 50 years and is the namesake for Wallace Middle School. Here's Teely's Meat Market. Their meat was cooled with 1,200-pound blocks of ice that had to be hauled in from San Marcos twice a week. Can you believe that? Now, one of the biggest businesses in the early days was Kyle's Cotton Gin, located just east of the tracks. The function of the gin was to separate the cotton from the seeds and the debris. And that clean cotton, does anybody know what it was called? Lint. Here's a picture of the Tompkins Company that sold groceries and dry goods. It was located where the modern-day Hays Free Press now stands. The owner, J.W. Tompkins, was Kyle's first mayor. Here's a picture of high schoolers in 1911. They went to Kyle School. Notice how they're dressed as they walk through that field. Today, it's a struggle to get my kids to wear anything other than Crocs and gym shorts. Kids, imagine dressing like this for school, and imagine that one of your classes is learning how to hoe a field. This is the brand new Kyle High School under construction in September 1911. It was located right next to modern-day Kyle Elementary. All right, now that we have our bearings in Kyle in 1911, let's pick up our story on Kyle Rogers as he heads south towards San Antonio. Kyle's superintendent, Sam Eaton, told the students that morning that a gong would ring as the VinFizz approached. When that happened, everyone was to march outside in a single file line and watch the plane from the school property. The students were excited, as you can imagine. On the square downtown, residents started gathering to watch the event as the time approached. And then it happened. On the ranch at the north end of town, Mrs. Bunton was the first to see the VinFizz and hear its engine. Immediately, she rang the bell to alert the community. But then she noticed something was wrong. If you folks will look out to the east, right over there where ACC is, imagine just above that, the first plane ever coming through the city of Kyle. And the story I'm about to tell you happened right over there. Rogers was at 3,500 feet, going 60 miles an hour when, according to him, one of his intake valves blew out, and the head dropped down and broke a hole in the piston. In other words, his engine completely broke apart, and the violence caused the VinFizz to tumble into an uncontrollable dive. His engine dead, Rogers held on to the elevator and warping levers with everything he had as he tried to slow his dive. He was over a wooded area, he said. Then he said there was no place to land that wouldn't decimate the biplane and him along with it. Then he noticed that just to the south was the small town of Kyle with a few fields that looked good for landing. Using the levers, he willed the plane level as the ground rushed up at him, narrowly missing the roofs of several homes and touched down. It's a true story. At the school, no sooner had the students heard the gong and looked out the window, it was immediately noticed that the plane was coming down. So do you think they went out in single file line? What was supposed to have been a well-organized march from the building turned into a riot and a mob. Pupils slid down the stairs, jumped out the windows, ran through the doors, and were on their way as fast as they could in the direction of the grounded aviator. The students, of course, were not alone. Folks downtown also saw what happened. Immediately, they jumped on their horses and buggies and tore out. Burleson Road was soon a mass of horses, a couple of cars, and hundreds of human beings, all in a dead sprint. Mrs. Bunton and her group were the first to arrive at the crash site. She later wrote that Rogers was so dazed, she could hardly get any sense out of him. He was terribly frightened, she wrote. Cal finally found the words, and he told her simply that he had just made a narrow escape. According to reporters who traveled with him, even though he had crash landed before, this was the closest Rogers had come to perishing on the journey. This is the image of the VinFizz in Kyle, Texas, the first time any airplane touched Earth in Hays County. 2 days later, on the morning of October 21st, with the sun shining and a crowd of Kyle residents surrounding his plane, Rogers once again ascending. For 20 minutes, he flew circles around Kyle. They say he did it to give the train time to get out ahead, but it didn't matter to Kyle residents. They stood there watching a plane fly around longer in the air than nearly anyone in the world ever had up to that point. 6 weeks after he left Kyle, Rogers touched down in Pasadena, California, completing his 4,000-mile transcontinental journey. He missed the $50,000 prize by a wide margin, but His daring journey made him the first man to complete a coast-to-coast flight in human history. The Vin Fiz Flyer now hangs in the Smithsonian, and the name Cal Rogers now holds its place in the record books. All right. As you can tell, thank you. Since I've researched this story, I have been captivated by what I learned. I think about those kids and how, after what they had just witnessed, they must have had the most amazing conversations about what the future held in store. Who among them could have imagined that just over 50 years later, not only would we be flying commercially all over the world, but Americans would be walking on the moon? Another thought I kept having was this. Imagine if I could snap my fingers and transport those students on the day after Rogers left directly to this podium. Can you even imagine how they would feel if they saw this town now? Do you think they would feel sorry for us if I told them how long the drive is from our air-conditioned house to our air-conditioned work and our air-conditioned car? Do you think they would feel sorry for me if I pulled out the supercomputer in my pocket and showed them something negative someone wrote about me on Facebook? I seriously doubt it. At any rate, those children were not magically transported from that moment to this. They walked through life one hard day at a time. Case in point, 3 years after the Vin Fiz landed in Kyle, America plunged into its first World War. One of those kids who jumped out the window was a sophomore named Lex Word. Legend has it, Lex actually signed his name on the wing. After high school, he spent a year at Texas A&M before enlisting in the U.S. Army. 2 years later, he was marching through France and Germany with artillery shells landing around him. Eventually, Lex returned to Kyle, and in 1924, he successfully founded what would become the longest operating and most storied business in Kyle history. Does anyone know what it was called? It was called the Bon Ton. The phrase Bon Ton means high society and first class. In reality, it was a department store, grocery store, and chicken hatchery all rolled into one. The spirit of the phrase is what made the store successful. Lex's daughter, Wynette, recounted the Bon Ton fondly. There were baby chicks in the hatchery to watch and bolts of cloth to examine that were soft and colorful. Glass cases were filled with fingernail polish, perfume, a necklace or two, nightgowns, buttons, safety pins, and knitting needles. There weren't 16 kinds of peas. There were just peas. Bananas arrived on the stalk, and it was a good idea to be careful in pulling them off because now and then a tarantula arrived hidden in the yellow cluster. Fruits, vegetables, and eggs came mostly from local farms, she said. Organic and vine ripened weren't words we used then. Where else would a tomato ripen but on the vine? Over time, Lex grew the Bon Ton into the largest and most successful business in Kyle. But success was not easy. With the Great Depression in full force, in the early hours of the summer day in 1934, a fire started from an incubator in the chicken hatchery. The Kyle Fire Department was severely underfunded at the time. They fought the fire the old-fashioned way, by passing buckets. Despite their best efforts, the blaze would consume all buildings on the and merchandise on the entire block. Tragically, the night watchman and janitor, who also lived in the back of the store, died in the fire. His name was Cal Clark, another Cal. This is Cal on the left, helping unload a train shipment with Lex, who is standing next to him. They had worked together in East Texas after the war and were friends. When Lex founded the Bon Ton, Cal walked 200 miles to take the job. Lex would rebuild, and the city raised money to purchase the city's first booster truck with a 300-gallon tank and hose. Now, some of you may have seen this picture of our famous mayor, Mary Kyle Hartson, sitting on a fire truck in front of the D.A. Young building. Now, you know what that fire truck meant to her. She became mayor shortly after the Bon Ton burned and is credited with helping to reorganize and fully fund the department. With this single truck, during her first term, the Kyle Fire Department extinguished over 40 fires. For 68 more years, the Bon Ton would prosper in downtown Kyle. It changed ownership several times through the years and was remodeled more than once. Then, in 2002, another fire consumed the building. No one was hurt this time, but the fire damage was absolute and the building demolished. The Bon Ton's new owners sold that lot to the city for a new city hall. And in 2007, shortly after the new city hall was complete, the Texas Historical Commission honored the site with an official designation of historical value. Next time you go by City Hall, stop and see it. And if you go by between now and Halloween, be sure to peek in the windows. Over the years, many staff members who have worked in that building swear they have felt a presence walking the halls. I personally think it's the spirit of the night watchman from 100 years ago, Cal Clark, keeping an eye on things. All right, so before I go any further, I should probably acknowledge something obvious. This state of the city is not like the 7 I have given that came before it. In every other year, I've stood at the podium and talked almost exclusively about current and future projects. But this time is different, and I want to tell you why. About a year ago, I started to suspect that this would be my final address as mayor. And while I was proud, deeply proud, of the direction this city was heading, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. For all our growth and progress, Kyle still seemed to be searching for its identity, for that sense of shared story that binds the community together. And if I'm being honest with you, at the time, I was searching for Kyle's identity as well. I loved this city in the sense that I wanted to help shape its future, but I did not feel overly connected to its past. So about a year ago, I decided to do something about that. I made a conscious decision. I wanted to learn the story of Kyle, not for political reasons, not for career reasons, but because I realized that if I could leave office with a love for Kyle's history, maybe I could help our community love it too. And that sounded to me like a pretty great way to go. So I will tell you, I had no idea how much Kyle history was going to affect me and how deep, frankly, the rabbit hole would go. It transformed my perspective on this town. Over the past year, I've collected thousands of photos and stories, images of the people, the buildings, the celebrations, and yes, the struggles that make up more than 145 years of this city's life. I've learned that every town has ghosts, and Kyle is no different. To understand how far we've come, you must go back and connect the stories together. Just 20 years before Kyle was founded, Texas was a slave state. It entered the Union in 1845, and by 1860, enslaved people made up nearly a third of the state's population. Hayes County had more slaves than most, fully 37% of our population. At the time, the Kyle family, the same family whose name our town carries, were the 4th largest slave holders in Hayes County. Fergus Kyle was 26 years old when the Civil War began. He enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army with the famous cavalry known as Terry's Texas Rangers. In Tennessee, Fergus fought in the Battle of Shiloh, which at the time was the bloodiest conflict in the Civil War. 23,000 soldiers died at Shiloh. Afterwards, Fergus was promoted to captain, and his 4 brothers, who were also fighting in the Confederate Army, were assigned to serve under him. He was a hero in the eyes of many, but his story is complicated. The war decimated the Kyles family wealth. And although Fergus later swore an oath to support the Union and was elected to serve in the Reconstruction government, by all accounts, he remained thoroughly entrenched in the Southern worldview. Even decades after the war, Fergus was famously known to wear his Confederate uniform every time he went to Austin. And before you start to think too negatively of Fergus, let me say something very clearly. He was not the only person who behaved that way, nor would he be the last. Fondness for the Confederacy and Southern pride would be a tradition in Kyle for many decades. The Civil War was not the end of racial tyranny, not in America, not in Texas, and not in Kyle. For example, when Kyle first incorporated it in 1906, the very first act of the new city council was to impose a $1 poll tax, which, for sharecroppers, most Mexican Americans, and virtually all recently freed slaves, was multiple days of income. Jim Crow laws soon followed, and for decades, segregation was the law of the land. Only white men were allowed to vote in the primaries. The train depot had separate sections for whites only. And if you don't believe me, you can go downtown to our train depot and see it for yourself. Schools were segregated too. Even cemeteries were segregated. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan held initiation ceremonies just outside the city limits, where more than 1,000 people drove in and attended. They burned crosses so brightly and openly that it was said you could see it from the train when you went by. And they did it all while waving the battle flag of the Confederacy. And yet, and this is important, in all the stories I have read about Kyle, in the early years, there's remarkably little evidence of open hostility among everyday neighbors. People worked, traded, and worshiped alongside one another. At the turn of the century, Kyle had become a deeply religious community. In 1900, they closed the bars and banned the sale of alcohol by a 4-to-1 margin. If you study Kyle history, we were rowdy before that. Churches sprung up all over town of every denomination. The community itself did not seem driven by hatred of one another in any way. Now, that is a hard thing to reconcile. The difference between personal decency and the embracing of structural inequity. For example, one of Kyle's most remarkable early citizens was David Alexander Young, who built the city's first permanent structure with his own hands. Young was a Confederate soldier who fought the entire duration of the war and who nearly lost his arm in the Battle of Mansfield. He was a man of deep faith, a pastor's son, a Bible teacher, and a community leader. And yet, like so many of his time, his life embodied the contradictions of the South. After his death at age 42, Young's wife, Fanny, was left to raise 7 children. She relied heavily on Ellen Burnham, a formerly enslaved woman who had fled bondage and come to the Youngs voluntarily. Known as Mock Mom, Ellen became the heart of that household, raising livestock, tending gardens, leading nightly prayers, and nurturing those children into adulthood. There is something deeply humbling and deeply unsettling about this story. A woman who loved the family of a man who fought to keep people like her enslaved. How can you reconcile that? But that's the story. And as my friend who loves history, Miss Lila Knight, has often said, to understand your history, you must learn to accept it as it was, the good and the bad, or to use her phrase, warts and all. If you ever get a chance, I want to encourage you to go check out the Kyle Cemetery on Stagecoach. It is a beautiful place, filled with some magnificent markers of the many founding families and their progeny. Claiborne Kyle is buried there. Claiborne was a 3-term state representative who sponsored the original bill that would lead to the establishment of Texas State in San Marcos. Next to Claiborne is his son, Fergus. Fergus is credited with the founding of Kyle. He was also a 3-term state representative who played a crucial role in preserving the Alamo. Next to Fergus lies his daughter, Mary Kyle Hartson, who was on the 1937 Time magazine cover as the only female mayor in Texas at the time. And I mean Life magazine, not Time magazine. My favorite picture of Mary Kyle Hartson is this one of her with the hoe. She used that hoe to pull weeds in front of City Hall. By her own admission, she was fed up with how the city had fallen behind during the years of the Bonton fire. And so she stepped up and led with the energy of a stern grandmother. Mary's brother, Edwin Kyle, also lies there. Edwin became a famous dean of agriculture at Texas A&M and was the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala. Kyle Field in College Station was named after him. In the books I've read, it is noted that one of Edwin's favorite things to do was travel back to the family land in Kyle and go fishing with his lifelong friend, a black man who lived on the family property. Do you see how contradictory this all is? Many other founding families are buried at the Kyle Cemetery, and they too have fascinating stories. 30 years ago, the state designated the site with a marker honoring its historical significance. And when you are done walking the Kyle Cemetery, walk right next door to the Kyle Pioneer Family Cemetery. That's where the slaves of Claiborne Kyle were buried, as well as many formerly enslaved peoples from the community. Many of those headstones are unmarked or weathered away. Their prior family lineage is unknown, and yet the Kyle Pioneer Family Cemetery now also has a designation by the state as being historically significant. And while their stories are not as well known as the founders next door, their lives were just as important, and they too are just as much our founders. Over time, the black community in Kyle produced civic leaders who would shape our town. They built businesses, they led churches, they elevated their voices. And in 1994, the city elected its first African American to the city council. Her name was Maddie Broadfoot. 4 years later, during an intense season of public debate about the Confederate flag and the rebel mascot at Hayes High School, the city elected its first black mayor, James Atkins. Mayor Atkins would lead Kyle for 7 years during the first major chapter of our explosive growth. He was a transformative figure. He led during the construction of the Kyle Pool. He was the mayor when we purchased the Bonton property for the new city hall. And perhaps most impressively to me, Mayor Atkins led the charge to bring back the train depot in Kyle after it left town. Preserving the very building with a sign inside that told the prior generation what room to stand in based on their color. It's inspirational, and it's our history. Now, with all of that said, there is a third piece to the puzzle of Kyle's past. It is true that most of the founders who bought land and built businesses in Kyle were white immigrants from Germany and settlers from Tennessee. But when you study our history, you will discover that others lived here even before them. They were the Tejanos, who became the Mexican Americans. These Hispanic settlers lived and worked all throughout Hays County and on the ranches and farms around town. They too were shunned by the laws and systems in place from our early years. Schools were segregated and opportunities for advancements limited. And despite that hardship, they too would become civic and business leaders who shaped our city. One of those figures was a man named Blas Tenorio and his family, serving as Kyle's first Hispanic alderman from 1965 to 1972. He was instrumental in delivering critical services like sewer lines and street lighting, projects we now take for granted, but which transformed everyday life at that time. Like the Bon Ton before them, Blas and his brother Sam built the Tenorio grocery store right next door and operated it successfully for over 30 years in Kyle. They owned property, developed other businesses, and left a legacy of public service that is hard to quantify in words. And do you remember me saying that in 1937, Kyle elected its first female mayor, Mary Kyle Hartson? Well, it would take 50 years before Kyle would elect its second. And this time, she would also be our first Hispanic mayor, male or female. She was Blas's niece, the 27-year-old Sandra Martinez Tenorio. Sandra won her election by a wide margin. And for the first time ever, she would serve on the first city council with an Hispanic majority. With all of these firsts, you would think that she would revel in the attention. And to be sure, she was asked about these things constantly in the newspapers. But this was her first interview from 1986. When asked about being the first Hispanic this and the first Hispanic that, her answers were incredible. It seems to be significant to a lot of people, she said, but it really isn't significant to me. To me, it's more important to make progress with the city. She would go on to talk about how the council being diverse didn't mean they formed voting blocks based on racial lines. It simply meant that democracy in Kyle was finally working in a more inclusive way. Regardless of your race or your gender, in Kyle, for the first time ever, you could win an election. Sadly, Sandra passed away recently. Thank you. She helped write some important chapters in Kyle history. Ann Buda, Ray, if I'm being honest. And speaking of important chapters, next Saturday, October 25th at 11 a.m., our community will gather at San Vicente Cemetery on Old Stagecoach Road to officially designate it too as historically significant. I hope you will join us as we unveil the new Texas Historical Commission marker honoring the Mexican and Mexican-American families who helped to shape the early history of Kyle and Hays County. Many of them rest there. They were pioneers whose names may not appear in our textbooks, but whose hands helped build the roads, farms, and businesses that sustained this community from the beginning. All right, I'm a little sweaty. As you can tell, I've thought a lot about these stories in recent months. And as I conclude, I want to say one thing very clearly. The stories I've shared tonight are just a sliver of Kyle history. If you think this speech is a little long, I assure you I cut out more than half. That's the beauty of Kyle. You cannot capture 150 years of history in 45 minutes. Our history is filled with courage and contradictions. The folks who came before us were not perfect. Just like today, they argued, they struggled, they failed, but they also built and dreamed and believed this little town could become something bigger. Think of Cal Rogers. He crashed 15 times on his way across the country, but never once did he give up on his quest. He rebuilt, he lifted off, and he moved forward. That same spirit has carried Kyle for 145 years through fires and floods, pandemics, and lots of growing pains, moral reckoning, and renewal. We've kept finding ways to rise just like Cal. And I'll tell you, this city has lifted me too. You, the community, have lifted me. 8 years ago, I gave my first city address as your mayor. I was extremely nervous, and I wanted to prove that I could lead, but I've made a ton of mistakes along the way. I will say, though, with each setback, I have tried to model the things I value: perseverance through hardship, courage in the face of opposition, a love of my city, and a big vision that guided my choices. My journey as mayor has changed me forever. I've served alongside 19 colleagues on the dais, 3 city managers, and hundreds of dedicated staff, all during a time when our community grew from 35,000 residents to 70,000. My hope is that 50 years from now, when someone else stands here, they'll tell stories about us, stories of courage, inclusion, and vision. And they'll say that in our time, whenever we crashed, we fixed what was broken, and we lifted off the ground and flew into the future forever. Thank you very much. All right. Y'all ready to see some fireworks? I want to do a countdown for the fireworks, but I realize I can walk and talk. I feel a little lonely up here. So what I have done before this event is I've invited the former city council members and mayors who still live in the area to come here and experience this event with us. And also we have our new city council as well. And I'd like to invite those folks who have come here to enjoy this speech to come to the stage with us. I'm doing it because I want you to understand that the city of Kyle's history and the city that you see today is not built by one person. It's built by a multitude of people over a multitude of years. And the people that are joining, and I want you to come, I promise I won't make you do a speech. The people who are going to come here have worked and given up their time and energy for this city. And I'm incredibly proud to know most of these folks. I'm proud to have served alongside quite a few of them. And I hope that you are proud of them as well. Thank you all. Yeah, come on up. All right. So, as it was said, the fireworks, y'all might want to get ready, but you can say sitting here, but they're going to be going off right over there. And this worked last year, so I'm hoping that it's going to work again this year. We nailed it last year. No pressure, Parks Department. So is everybody ready? Are we ready to do a countdown? All right, I need your voices. Can y'all help us with the voices? All right, here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom! There we go.
Oh, beautiful, for heroes proved in liberating strife. Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, make God thy gold refined, till all success be when I was in school, we used to sing it something like this. Listen here. Oh, beautiful, far spacious skies, far amber waves of grain, far purple mountain majesties, over the fruited plain. But now wait a minute, I'm talking about America, sweet America. You know, God done shed his grace on thee. He crowned thy good. Yes, he did.